Okay, so my name is Snowy, and some of you might know me from Rock On Life and Food Spotting in South Korea. Anyways, I worked on a time-lapse video project recently, and I knew for sure people were gonna ask me how to do a time-lapse, how to get on a roof, how to do a hyperlapse. So this will be one of the series of videos that tries to explain how I made this. This is how to do a time-lapse, regular time-lapse. And first thing you will need, well, you don't actually need, but you need a camera. Here I have a DSLR. Mirrorless works fine too, but there's certain things I want to go over when making a time lapse, and most of them are going to be DSLR related. Now, one of the first things I want to go over are the settings. Now, settings vary widely depending on the time of the day, so I can't give you an exact set of settings, but I can tell you kind of a list of things to look for. The first thing I want to talk about is the interval, how long between each shot, and that really depends on what you're filming. If you're filming people, you want an interval of something like 1 or 2 seconds between each shot. Now, I do a lot of cityscapes, and I'm pretty much on a roof most of the time, so the only thing I'm looking at are basically clouds and cars. Now, if the clouds are moving really quite slow, maybe something like 6 seconds, 7 seconds works perfectly. But if the clouds are moving very fast, then you might want to look at something like 3 seconds, for example. Now, general settings, like I say. Now that I went over the interval of how many seconds between each picture, you want to look at the ISO, the f-stop, and the shutter speed. Now, ISO, you want to keep it as low as possible, so of course you're going to need something like ISO 100, or I don't know, I think Nikon is ISO 200, but anyways, you want to keep the ISO as low as possible. Your aperture should be, well, if you want to keep everything in focus, you should have an aperture of maybe f8. I usually shoot most of my time lapses at f8 or f11, depending on what I'm shooting. Now, let's say I want to include something in the foreground and focus on the background as well, then I go up to f16. I wouldn't recommend going over that, because then you have diffraction and your picture actually becomes softer. But that's physics, you know. I don't really have time to go into that. Just remember f8 or f11. And if you have something in the foreground, f16. Now, here's where it gets kind of complicated. When you're shooting a time lapse, you're either going to have a very jittery movement of people moving, and this is due to really high shutter speed. So you have people appearing in one place and appearing in another, and to me, I personally don't like that. I think it looks like shit. So here's how I'm going to explain. You want to have some sort of motion in your pictures, and the only way you can achieve that is by having a slow shutter speed. So when shooting people, generally anything over half a second shutter speed will give them kind of a blurry effect. So what this does is it makes your time lapse look more fluid. So when there's people moving, you kind of see the movement of people, and it's not this warpy jump left, jump right effect that doesn't make a good time lapse, in my opinion. If you're doing kind of sunsets or something at night photography, it's perfect. You have a low shutter speed, you have a high aperture, low ISO, so you're gonna be able to get to those low shutter speeds without overblowing your picture. Now, what I mean is overblowing is when the whites or the lights in your video are too bright that you can't see what you want to see. You just see like a bunch of white. That's what happens at very low shutter speeds if you're shooting in the day. However, if you're shooting at night, then actually what happens is the shutter speeds are usually, you want lower shutter speeds so you can let in more light. So if you're shooting in the day, you're probably gonna have to invest in a neutral ND filter. So something that makes, I don't know how to explain it, something that cuts the light going into the camera, so that lets you achieve much lower shutter speeds and you can go. So yeah, I know you guys still want to know settings, and really, like I say, it really depends on what you're shooting. If you're shooting in the middle of the day, you're not going to be using my settings, and depending on what you're shooting at night and where at night and how much light is available, you're gonna have to change it. Okay, so one other thing that you have to watch out for is time-lapse flicker. Now, if you're just starting to do time-lapse, you might not notice this thing called flicker, but if you're kind of like a professional and you're very time-lapse enthusiast, then you might notice flicker when you're doing some time lapses, especially at high apertures. If you're shooting open like at 2.8 or 3 point something, whatever, you might not notice it so much. But if you're shooting at much higher apertures, what's going to happen is when you're doing a time lapse, especially during the day, you're going to see the background kind of flicker, get a little bit darker and then go a little bit brighter. And I personally don't like it, and I think it looks like shit, but I'm going to explain why it happens. So when you're looking through your camera's viewfinder, basically the iris is open. As soon as you click the shutter, the iris is going to close and take a picture at the appropriate aperture. Now, every time the aperture closes to take a picture, there's very small changes. You know, the camera is not perfect. It's always going to be just a little bit off between each picture. So when you put all these pictures into a time lapse, what's going to happen is that you're going to see these little fluctuations in exposure, as small as they are, but that causes you to get flicker in your time lapse. Now, there's two ways to get rid of flicker. The first is to use a manual lens. Now, some of you might think that's a little expensive, but actually manual lenses are like what, $50? They're very cheap. So you have a manual lens with a click aperture, so the aperture stays the same throughout the whole time lapse and it's not going to change. Okay, so here we have some manual lenses. They're not very costly. They're like $30 or something. I'm thinking in won. Anyways, as you can see, you can open and close the iris. And what happens is when you do a time lapse, this thing fluctuates with automatic lenses, and even if you have the same aperture, it's always just like a fraction of a decimal off, which causes flicker. But if you use a manual lens, the aperture is fixed, and then you won't have that problem anymore. So you can always get these and have like a converter so that you can put these on more modern cameras. Now, there is also kind of something else that I do, and that is I use this Nikon automatic lens, but since it is for Canon, I use a converter, and with this converter I don't have manual control of the aperture, so I have to use these little levers to change the aperture. So using this lens, I can also not have flicker. Then that will get rid of flicker. The second method, or actually kind of like one method that I use, is when you use your camera, well actually it's called the half twist method. What you do is you hold open the aperture preview button for your camera, and then you're going to unscrew it halfway, and what this does is it's going to lock in the aperture that you set it to preview while you twist the lens on the camera, and it's going to disconnect it from the little electrical connector so that the aperture stays locked into place, and then you can do your time lapse. Okay, now I want to demonstrate the lens twist method, since some people probably aren't comfortable or want to pay for a manual lens. Basically, on a DSLR you have two buttons in the front. It's the depth of field preview button and the lens release. So what you do is, after you have your focus and your aperture set, you hold the depth of field preview button, and what that does is it makes the aperture shrink down to the size that you want it to, and while you do that, while you're holding down the depth of field preview button, you push the lens release, and that helps release the lens. Okay, sometimes it takes more than one hand, but press the button to turn on the depth of field preview button, release the lens, and then twist the lens halfway so that it's not making electrical contact with the camera. Sometimes you get an error message saying that the contacts aren't touching. What you do is just twist the lens a little bit more. Anyways, the only thing you gotta do is be careful not to change the focus or the focal length depending on what kind of lens you have. I mean, yeah, if it's a zoom lens, you gotta be careful not to zoom in or zoom out. But that's it for the lens twist method, and don't forget to twist it back to your original way once you're done. So once that's set, you just set your time lapse, and you can get an aperture, a flicker-free time lapse. The only thing that's going to happen is that once you do this, when you look through your viewfinder, it's going to be darker than normal. So you're probably going to have to set the exposure first, then do the twist method to kind of disconnect your lens from the camera, and then you can start your time lapse. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at something very dark, but when you take a picture, it's going to take the exposure that you set. Well, something else I want to touch on is focus. Most cameras come equipped with like a little magnifying thing, so you can like magnify in on your picture, and you want to be sure that you set your focus before you start the time lapse. It seems like a no-brainer, but there's been some times when I've been like on a roof that I can't get on again, and then I get back home and I realize I didn't focus beforehand. So just a little reminder, set your focus before your time lapse starts and you should be ready. Now that you have all your settings ready for the time lapse, how do you actually do it? Well, some cameras have a built-in intervalometer. Intervalometer basically tells your camera to take a picture every few seconds. I'm using a Canon camera, and for most Canon cameras or DSLRs, I don't want to call it a hack, it's more like a firmware that you put on an SD card, but there's something called Magic Lantern, and with Magic Lantern it gives you extra options on the camera, and one of those options is a built-in intervalometer. Now if you don't have a built-in intervalometer, you can buy one. I mean, they're only like $12, and that's basically like a little wire that you connect to your camera, you set your settings, and then just let it go. Set it and forget it. But let's say you're too poor to afford an intervalometer, then you can just press the shutter every few seconds, but make sure it's the same interval. Like let's say I press the shutter every 5 seconds, and then that will take a picture. That's like the poor man's way of doing a time lapse, but it works as long as you have a tripod. That's another thing. You're doing a time lapse, you're going to need a tripod, especially you don't want to be holding a camera for like an hour or something, right? So make sure you have a tripod, and that's basically it. I mean, that's the first half of the video. I can go over how to process a time lapse in the second video, but that's it for how to shoot a time lapse for now.